So yes, this is Joe Kresko. I'm with the Advanced Manufacturing Office at the U.S. Department of Energy, part of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And thanks for attending. We've got a great panel this afternoon. I'll give a few slides to kick off and introduce the session. And then we will be joined by David Deek, Rod Colwell, William Boursier, and Ravi Prasher. And it's a great group that will take a look at a little bit more deeply at sort of the manufacturing and supply chain issues related to battery production. So I'll give a little bit of background on very quickly on our panelists today. Rod Colwell is a seasoned corporate executive specializing in geothermal, minerals, commercial property development. He has 25 years of experience in property and energy sectors to lead the development of their direct lithium extraction and geothermal power project in the Imperial Valley, California. David Deek is a PhD as an entrepreneur whose background spans lithium mining, battery supply chain development, renewable energy and storage, and electric vehicles. He's the president of Marbex, a battery materials consultancy, and an operating partner with Azimuth Capital Management. William Boursier is trained as a geologist, economic geologist, and material scientist. Spent much of his career at Lawrence Livermore Lab working on geothermal energy, carbon management, and water treatment technologies. Left Livermore in 2008 to co-found Symbol Mining Corporation to focus on developing extraction technologies to harvest byproducts from geothermal brines. And Ravi Prasher is associate lab director at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, and an expert in manufacturing technologies, and really looking forward to hearing from everybody today. So I'll go ahead and walk through a few slides today. I'm wondering if, let me know if we have the wrong screen up, but I'll walk through a few slides today just to introduce this session. First, I'd like to give a little bit of background about the Department of Energy's Energy Storage Grand Challenge. This is an initiative that is a U.S. Department of Energy office-wide initiative. As you can see from the 5 integrated tracks that comprise the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, a number of different offices are leading these different tracks, which include technology development, sort of fundamental energy storage development of technologies, technology transitions, which is led by the Office of Tech Transitions, a policy and evaluation track, domestic manufacturing and supply chain, which is led out of the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy in the Advanced Manufacturing Office, my office, and workforce development, another key feature of the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, which is led by the Office of Science. And so if you just Google Energy Storage Grand Challenge, I'm sure many folks are familiar with this initiative, but if you Google it, you can find out a lot more information. So I'll just touch and highlight a few elements. Within those tracks, we realize that ultimately the development and deployment and utilization of energy storage technologies is really sort of fundamentally driven by a range of different use cases. And so we've highlighted here 6 key use cases that the Energy Storage Grand Challenge is oriented around. Facilitating an evolving grid. We're looking forward in time, thinking about what today's grid looks like and what the future looks like. Energy storage to serve remote communities. Of course, electrified mobility, perhaps the biggest market driver today and in the near future. Interdependent network infrastructure. How does this evolving grid and the utilization of things like electrified mobility require and depend upon a network infrastructure? Of course, resilience and recovery, really important to be prepared, have energy storage technologies that can be both resilient and serve needs for recovery purposes. And ultimately, things like facility flexibility, efficiency, and value enhancement. And how can we leverage the natural and inherent assets of our sectors to drive and improve energy storage opportunities. So with respect to manufacturing and supply chain, the role of manufacturing is pervasive. This requires or allows for both the the acceleration and scale up of emerging manufacturing processes, where we address technical barriers in the production and manufacturing. And this also requires us to improve the critical materials supply chain resilience. Apologies for some PowerPoint problems there that we're seeing. So that's what we're really trying to highlight and touch on today, thinking about these emerging manufacturing processes and the supply chain that are needed to ultimately overcome the technical barriers to production of energy storage technologies. So we can think about this sort of pathway, sort of a linear pathway that we've traditionally thought of for the utilization, the extraction utilization of materials that go into components, the manufacture of these energy storage systems that have an end use, and then end of life. And so within the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, we're thinking about R&D areas that include everything ranging from process intensification to manufacturing processes for new materials that can operate in even harsh service conditions. And these application spaces range from, of course, lithium-ion batteries to pumped hydro to syn fuels and thermal energy storage and combined heat and power. So it's a very wide-ranging opportunity space. So a couple things to kind of think about as we kick off our discussion today and lead into our discussions today. Some work out of the National Renewable Energy Lab that I think is really helpful to take a look at when we want to think about when we think about wanting to develop and utilize energy storage technologies. We need to recognize how we have interdependencies on our supply chains that are global. And if it's not all that difficult to take a look at just this map, relatively recent data sourced on USGS information and synthesis by the National Renewable Energy Labs that shows the United States from a sourcing perspective today doesn't have is not the the source of materials, fundamental materials that go into, for example, lithium-ion batteries, the cobalt, the nickel, the lithium, manganese, and naturally occurring graphite. So we have this dependency on global supply chains. And in fact, more than 50% of production of three of those elements originates in one country for cobalt, graphite, and lithium. So this presents, challenges and also an opportunity for thinking about for example, end of life with lithium-ion batteries. By extraction, we know we need a significant amount of ore to extract these materials, and that has both economic as well as environmental consequences for that sort of linear supply chain. But when we think about a more circular supply chain and opportunities to recover materials at end of life, we can think about both the environmental benefits, the domestic job creation benefits. Ultimately, lower battery costs could potentially result from these processes when we think about our source of batteries being materials at end of life. So I think these are aspects that are important to consider where we think about the synergy and intersection between the manufacturing sector and the supply chain. So critical materials is very important for our opportunity space. The Advanced Manufacturing Office invests in the Critical Materials Institute as one example to really think about end of life and substitution opportunities for critical materials. And then through the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, there's a lot of opportunities that come through funding opportunities that are put out by the Advanced Manufacturing Office, other offices in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, as well as other offices across DOE. And so keep your eyes on those opportunities and selections that are occurring. So I'd like to thank folks. If you want to learn a little bit more about any of these opportunities that I talked about, take a look at manufacturing.energy.gov. And with that, I'll turn it back to the next speaker.
risk to development, more so, and some of those other opportunities that come with it, manufacturing, etc. That is open for opportunities. So obviously, I won't dwell on this too much. I think all of you in the audience realise the supply-demand crossover inflection point, coming into 2023, with operational supply, highly probable, so on and so forth. Well, there's, the 121 mega factories to be delivered by 2030 is currently dominated by China. We're starting to see a shift for onshoring. Just a self-observation, 2 million tonnes of supply LCE by 2030. Given that there's 300,000 tonnes currently delivered now, it's quite an uptake. Dominance, there's planned expansions, of course, in Australian spodumene and South America's salars and brines, but there's a real crunch by 2023. And obviously, we're a lithium energy, really lithium first or mining first with power second. But it's important to note that, really our byproduct here is thermal energy. Our brines are just hotter. It's similar brines to anywhere else, but we have all of this energy, and the most efficient way is to cool that energy through a steam turbine. And you can see here where the California's grid and instability with, solar, wind and everything else that's come online was predominantly sort of dominated by 61% natural gas. So there's a lot that geothermal energy, or the byproducts of thermal baseload energy, can do for this system. You can see some of the regulations, and to get to a carbon neutrality, there's a lot of gas, 30,000 megawatts of it that needs to be somehow displaced and moved to reach those goals. A little bit about our project. We've been, what's my 9th year out here. These are long-term, long planning processes. I think, timing-wise, lithium's caught up a lot. There's a lot of work done, and I'm sure Bill's been around this longer than I have, Bill. But, the couple of facts about the field: this is the largest known geothermal power field, lithium brine resource known on the planet. It's geothermal power resource on the planet, I beg your pardon. And it's such a, it's been in operations out here since the early 1980s, so close to 38 years approximately of operating experience. So our development plans to be delivered in 2023 is 140 megawatts of power, which have sold a big chunk of that. Close to LCE, so lithium carbonate, approximately 7,500 tonnes, equivalent to around 20,000 metric tonnes per train. So meaning that we develop 140 megawatts and 2 trains LCE. It looks like at this stage we'll be possibly running with hydroxide with our discussions. Our resource, we have a very, very, very large resource out here that we could ultimately produce 300,000 metric tonnes per annum LCE, and equivalent with that thermal byproduct of 1,100 megawatts of power, which could virtually replace half of Diablo Canyon once it's offline. Additional minerals, which we will focus on, includes potassium, magnesium iron, and rubidium, and other minerals once get to the surface. The advantages, I guess, more so than anything else, are the CO2 credentials. We're starting to read a lot of that out of Europe. But really, thermal brines, we cover a very small footprint on the foreshore of the Salton Sea. It enables for other types of development, ag use, other environmental developments to happen around us. There's no open pit mining, evaporation ponds, completely powered by renewable energy. So the sustainability reports that are coming out seems to hit those versus evaporation ponds, those salars, where you're looking at evaporating 500,000 gallons per metric ton of lithium ultimately produced. All of that's offshore, goes to China, very large footprint. It's a long process of 12 to 18 months. And similarly to spodumene, which is the dominant party in hydroxide at the moment, but similar large footprint, hard rock mining, dig up 100 tons of rocks and get 6 tons ultimately down the track of lithium products. So it's a very an environmentally friendly process. It's a quick slide we've put together here that sort of compares hard rock spodumene, at 14.8 kilograms per kilogram of spodumene or lithium hydroxide produced, to Argentine brines or salars at approximately 7.4, to geothermal salt and sea brines at 0.6. So it's a significant reduction in CO2 numbers. Similarly for power versus coal, typical baseload power or traditional baseload power, you see the CO2 numbers here, comparison to combined cycle gas, as you noted on the slide prior, which was still at a significant number compared to what we actually produce in CO2. Jobs, our project, we're in the most impoverished area in the state, and comments in this session will talk about obviously third-party opportunities, precursor, cathode, battery manufacturers, etc. But these are the job numbers for our project. We're sort of shovel ready. This is a sensible approach in response to COVID-19. There's environmental issues out here with the sea receding. We cover some of those off, but you can see here close to 2,000 project jobs for the life of the project, all 8 stages. Ancillary jobs, the power and direct and indirect impacts as far as taxes and etc. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank the organizers here for making this event possible, and appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone. My talk today, which I'll try to wrap up as quickly as possible so that we can get on to the discussion, the panel discussion at the end, is about what sort of ingredients are needed for an ultra-sustainable battery supply chain. And just for a bit of background, I used to work for Tesla, where I was in charge of figuring out how Tesla would source its raw materials for batteries, and particularly focused on anode materials and lithium, and a few of the other sort of upstream battery materials. And so that's the sort of context in which I sort of started my career in this space. After Tesla, I was the chief technical officer at Lithium Americas, that is developing 2 mining projects, one in Argentina, a brine-based resource, and the other in Nevada, a clay-based resource. And about 2 years ago, I started my own advisory and consulting business in the upstream battery supply chain, with a real focus on engaging with projects that have a pathway towards commercialization, and coupled with a sort of pathway towards decarbonization as well. So why ultra sustainable? The way I look at it is that there, a lot of people would think of energy as a cost to a process, and as well, when you think about being sustainable, one often thinks of, well, you have to add costs to processes to make it more sustainable. But I actually see it in a very different way. If you engineer towards a lower footprint, you will end up consuming less as you produce more. And the whole thesis there is that by basically reducing, whether it be land footprint, reagent footprint, water footprint, energy footprint, it will lead towards lower cost footprint, and therefore the prospect for higher margins. So this is the way I sort of look at things, and the way I encourage development projects up in the mining space to look and sort of navigate into the market. And when it comes to developing a lithium valley, so to speak, in California, there's a massive opportunity here, and I'll go into that very shortly. So how do you achieve an ultra-sustainable supply chain? It really starts at the beginning. Start from where you get your material from out of the ground, from the mine. Because this is also where the largest footprint is, whether you're looking at emissions or even land footprint, water footprint, all of the environmental drivers towards what makes a project sustainable or not. The biggest impact is usually in the upstream. So when you're actually mining materials, because when it comes to the downstream parts, whether you're making the active material, assembling cells, or doing pack assembly and assembling vehicles, the vast majority of energy consumption, of materials movement, of materials consumption, reagent consumption, that all happens in those first few steps. And by focusing on those, on sort of the first step of the supply chain, if you're working on decarbonization and coming up with innovative approaches to doing so, then there's a cascading effect. So if you figure out how to mine lithium without any emissions whatsoever, without the use of fossil fuels, the tools and the sort of platforms that you develop there have a cascading effect, in the sense that they can translate downstream as well, the sort of principles that get developed and innovated towards. So what I want to bring to everyone's attention as well is that when it comes to figuring out what the emissions are for producing raw materials for making batteries, this graph here gives you a little bit of an illustration as to there's really a wide variation in what the carbon footprint in particular for different reagents is. And even within different reagents, if you source from two different types of resources with different types of processes, you can have quite drastically different footprints associated with that. So if in this graph, you can see that one of the widest ranging carbon footprints that you can achieve is when you're sourcing lithium hydroxide. There are certain sources that have a very low footprint and certain sources that have a very high footprint. What are the ingredients for an ultra sustainable supply chain? So I'll dig into lithium just as an example. It's obviously the topic of our slide here, of our session here, and obviously that's where my background comes in. So I figure I'll just point out some of the things that are very important, whether you're looking at this from the perspective of a potential producer or from a potential consumer of these raw materials. So lithium today comes from either brines or hard rock resources, and there's a potential third resource from sedimentary materials or clays that's in development. And all three are very scalable, accessible resources that can be commercialized. But when you look at the footprint of sourcing lithium from different types of resources, there is clearly a winner here. Whether you're looking at the carbon footprint, the water footprint, or the land footprint, if you are sourcing lithium from geothermal brines, such as what you have in the Salton Sea, there's a step change in environmental performance, effectively. And this data here comes from work that was done by Minviro, a company that does life cycle assessments for mining projects, and was commissioned by Energy Source Minerals, which works in the Salton Sea and for which I'm an advisor to. But you know, the real takeaway here is that there's a real opportunity, and it really comes down to the fact that you can combine and leverage the geothermal energy aspect of the resource to, you know, drive the processing for which you extract lithium. And this is one example of what could be many in terms of how you can decarbonize mining operations and supply chains, is to figure out and design your process in a way that you don't consume fossil fuels, but come up with other innovative ways to either harvest energy that's renewable, or even produce it in, you know, there's certain chemical reactions that you may be able to take advantage of that are exothermic and produce energy in the process that you can utilize, and so forth. So really what this comes down to, what are the ingredients for producing lithium? It's all about meeting the customer needs. And, you know, a customer, whether it be Tesla or Volkswagen or any other OEM, what they'll be looking towards, of course, is, you know, cost, scale, reliability, and environmental performance. But, you know, to tangibly list out what are the things that are needed when you are a developer, you do need a resource of scale. The Salton Sea is a place that could provide that, especially when you compare it to other types of resources worldwide. It would be great if you could leverage renewable energy sources, such as the geothermal energy that comes out of the Imperial Valley. You need a commercially viable process, and one in which, again, you leverage what resources you have in terms of energy, but you need the knowledge and the expertise to be able to deploy a viable process. You need an execution team that is very mission driven, with the knowledge and drive to make something like this happen in terms of producing more lithium. You also need a stable and suitable jurisdiction. California is a great place, of course, to do business. And then you need your customer base as well. They need to be engaged with the qualification in terms of the offtake. You need the right kind of investors. That's actually one thing that, like, the lithium space really needs more of, is confident backers who can provide money into these sorts of projects. And you also want to establish what I would call is an industrial ecosystem that synergizes with your operations. So, you know, if you co-locate cathode manufacturing or battery recycling in the same area and same spot, there are certain resources that you can leverage off each other, whether it be in the form of reagents, or you know, one person's product could be another person's you know, consumables. And you know, to bring this all together, it's really important to come up with a vision for all stakeholders in the region. So, you know, provide jobs, lower the environmental impact, and obviously make this a sort of thriving opportunity. So with that, I'll wrap up and pass on to the next presentation, but really keen to get into the conversation that follows.
Particular panel. Very exciting. I'm actually learning quite a bit myself from our colleagues who are developing technologies in the field. I'm going to give you a little bit more of a researchy perspective. I work at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab as the Associate Lab Director for the Energy Technologies area. And we are actively researching this particular topic because as you already saw from both our earlier presenters, that this is a very, very important problem to be solved. So what I'm going to talk about, how do we do selective lithium extraction? Why is it important, and what are some of the technical challenges, opportunities, and what the outlook looks like? So we already saw it from our colleagues that two main sources of lithium right now are either in South America or in Australia. One is through brines, solar brines, another is mineral ores. So these are the two main sources. And here are some of the challenges with these two sources of lithium. For the brines, the most common method is evaporation. The way you extract lithium is basically you have multiple steps and multiple evaporation ponds, right? And through that, you evaporate the water, and then what really comes out is lithium carbonate. You already saw from David's slides that there's a huge land footprint and water footprint, as well as the time required is totally dependent on natural evaporation is quite large. It's almost 18 months. So one challenge is how do we reduce the land and the environmental footprint, as well as reduce the number of steps. For the ores, Australia is the leading producer. Again, similar to the brines, you got to go through multiple treatment steps, and there's also a significant, it's like an energy hog, because you got to heat these rocks and the ores at a very, very high temperature, almost up to 1100 degrees Celsius. So that requires a lot of energy. Time required is not years, but it's still days, and the cost can be up to 2x compared to brine evaporation ponds, and primarily because you require significant amount of energy to heat treat these ores and the rocks. So what is really needed is if possible, that how do we get rid of multiple pre-treatment steps that will have impact, both environmental impact as well as energy impact. Current technologies focus on removing other contaminants in order to obtain lithium, which contributes to the cost. If we can have technology that can focus selectively in capturing lithium itself from the conventional reserves, that can be a potential game changer if we can do that. And finally, looking into unconventional reserves. We already heard from two talks earlier was Salton Sea geothermal brines. It is very exciting. It has a very high concentration of lithium, but again, it's a technically challenging problem because you have a very high temperature brine, and which is really good for power generation, but not necessarily easy to do lithium extraction at such high temperatures. Sedimentary lithium in Nevada, that's another very, very good source of very high concentration. There also has been a lot of research, just excitement about seawater, because in terms of absolute amount of lithium available is huge, except that the concentration is so dilute that it has its own share of technical challenges. And finally, from produced water from oil and gas reserves. So that's another potential source of tapping into lithium reserves. So I'm going to give you some examples. One example is from the lab. Is there a way to increase the evaporation itself on a solar pond? Right. So the way it is done today is you just have sunlight, and as we all know, the sunlight, there's a lot of energy in infrared, and a lot of energy in the visible part of the sunlight. But water is transparent to visible radiation, and that's why the evaporation rate is pretty slow, because absorption of radiation is very, very low. However, if you look at absorption coefficient of water as a function of wavelength, you will see that near mid IR, which is right here, around 10 microns and above wavelength, it has a very, very high absorptivity, right? So in the lab, we developed what we call as a photothermal umbrella. It's like a radiation transformer. So it takes all the sunlight, converts all the visible radiation into mid-infrared radiation. Okay, and what it does is, because of that, all the radiation almost get absorbed right at the surface within 100 microns, and significantly enhances the evaporation. So in a proof of concept, we showed 2x evaporation enhancement, which basically means half the land area and half the time required. So anyway, this is just one example of looking at different ways of enhancing the efficiency and reducing the environmental footprint for retrieving lithium from brines. There have been also recently some studies and research has started coming out on how do you extract lithium from seawater. This is one example on the left-hand side I'm showing, where they have shown a sort of a vision of solar-powered lithium extraction device, where you have a lithium selective membrane, and the membrane separates the lithium from the water, and then you can collect that lithium. And recently a paper came out from Stanford on a pulsed electrochemical method, where they showed that they can do lithium extraction from brines and seawater through intercalation of lithium into sodium. So these are very, very early stage ideas, but if they show promise and if they are scalable, then maybe seawater, lithium from seawater may become a reality. But again, we have to keep in mind that this solution is still very dilute. Lithium concentration is very dilute. So collection of that lithium is also going to be another technical challenge. Here in the lab, we have started a center, which is called LIRC, Lithium Innovation to Accelerate the Resource to Research Cycle. And it spans various areas of the lab, all the way from earth and environmental science, energy geoscience, and energy technologies area. And quite a few scientists are involved in this particular center. And what our vision is to establish national leadership in lithium cycle, starting from natural resources, with survey, extraction, processing, manufacturing, and recycling, demonstrate power of United States lithium to revolutionize energy landscape. And again, we are doing it because we need to clean air, clean water, and more sustainable lithium systems. And the roadmap that we have in mind is development of novel technologies that reduce the cost and energy required for selective lithium extraction from both conventional and unconventional resources, integration of extraction technology with established industries like geothermal on mining, and production of commercial grade lithium compound within 5 years. And the focus is on selectivity. As I said, if we can selectively remove lithium, right, that can be really a game changer. And because the current costs are mostly driven by multiple steps pre and post treatment, then concentration refining to obtain different qualities of lithium. And other factors will be extraction, recovery efficiency, and time duration of extraction. This is my last slide. This is the vision that we have. We're looking into various different ways and different sources, thermal, chemical, and electrochemical. High temperature and pressure in geothermal brines can be used for lithium concentration because it can potentially lead to faster kinetics. Chemical, lithium extraction using adsorbents, for example, and finally electrochemical techniques where potentially you can use membranes to selectively extract lithium out of brines. So with that, I'm just going to stop here and I'm looking forward to the rest of the panel.
some skeptics out there because this has been something that people have toyed with for the last 40 years. It started with the Bureau of Mines in the 1970s. There have been several attempts to extract metals from geothermal fluids, all of which so far have been unsuccessful. But are we there now, and is it likely to be successful? And that's what I'd like to address with my talk. First of all, just to reiterate what Rod had talked about, what we're talking about here is removing lithium from geothermal fluids. Geothermal plants themselves pull heated water from a hot reservoir in the subsurface, generate electricity, and then re-inject, and it's a cycle. What we want to do is just, prior to re-injection, borrow that fluid for a while and extract valuable minerals such as lithium from it. So how big a deal is this? If we estimate for all the existing geothermal plants worldwide right now, if we extracted all of their lithium, that's about 400,000 tons per year lithium carbonate equivalent. So just for framework, the current use of lithium carbonate in various markets is about that, maybe a little bit less than 350,000 tons per year. So it's a fairly sizable amount of lithium available if we're able to do this. And as Rod had mentioned earlier, the Salton Sea geothermal system itself is very unique in the world. In fact, it is unique in the world. When I was with Symbol Mining about 10 years ago, one of our, what we were asked for in some patent processing was where else, if this technology works at the Salton Sea, where else could it be used? And the answer was really nowhere. It is unique. There's one similar field in Djibouti in East Africa that it's not nearly as big, but has some of the same characteristics. So there's a high energy field, lots of lithium in it. Just at the Cal Energy site in the Salton Sea right now, there's about 350 megawatts of production. If you recovered lithium at the Cal Energy, which is the Berkshire Hathaway site, it'd be about 100,000 tons per year with about a 350 megawatt capacity. So that's already comparable or getting close to the entire global production. And as I think Rod also mentioned, people estimate that about 2,000 megawatts of expansion is available there. There's about 350 with Cal Energy, another 50 or so with Energy Source and CPR coming online. But if you did build it out to 2,000 megawatts, you're talking more like 600,000 tons of lithium carbonate equivalent per year. So we're looking at 5 years from now needing about 1 million tons per year. This is going to be, if successful, your player in this whole effort. And let's see. Issues with this, every method of recovering lithium has its advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages of the Salton Sea geothermal field is it's a very concentrated salt brine, has lots of metals in it. So then you sit down and try to say, I want a selective extraction technology that just pulls lithium out. There's a lot of competitors. So it means basically a lot of pre-treatment has to be done with that fluid before you can get it in good enough shape to pull just the lithium out. The good news there, though, is that the other minerals you're trying to select against have value as well. That's why, again, Rod referred to his effort, this controlled thermal resources, as more of a mining effort that also produces electricity. If you look here at say, a plant the size of the Cal Energy operation there, in terms of just gross values of stuff in the fluid that could be extracted per year in millions of dollars per year, lithium alone is worth over $1 billion, $10 per kilogram. The electrical energy is about $400 million. And then potash itself is worth over $1 billion a year. So the minerals themselves, and this is just gross value, it doesn't account for, the cost of production or the margins, but it suggests that really going after the minerals is a lot smarter and making electricity as you can out of whatever heat is used or sacrificed in the process. Electricity is only 13% of the total. The other takeaway from this is that the valley itself is so rich in lithium, so much potential for production. As David had said, you might want to consider actually locating the battery manufacturing facility near the source of lithium. The producers themselves might want to do this because the value added of lithium, like just about everything else, comes after the mining takes place. With rare earths, and maybe you remember the effort by the Mountain Pass facility by Molycorp, they wanted to make the harvest rare earths, but also turn them into magnets and sell, because most of the profitability comes, not from the sale of the bulk resource, the lithium carbonate, but the final product. Extraction technology, this is the area I've worked in for the last 10 years, mostly not developing them, but testing them, seeing and estimating costs. As Rafi just pointed out, lithium is a hard metal to separate from other metals because it is a simple s electron hard sphere, ionically bonding. There's no handles on it to develop functional groups or ways to separate it. No covalency in the interaction. So right now, if you go online and look for a lithium ion exchanger, in a classical sense, a functionalized polymer B, there isn't one, because there is no group really that can separate monovalent lithium from monovalent sodium or potassium. It's just very difficult to do. Because of this, there are two technologies that have been developed over the last 20, 30 years, where it takes advantage of the very small size, crystallographic small size of lithium. The lithium ion is much smaller than the sodium ion when they're not hydrated in solution in a brine. So two of the crystalline materials, the aluminate, which is the material that Symbol is working on, and the so-called LMO, lithium manganese oxide spinel structured, a true ion exchanger, exchanges lithium for hydrogen, has sites in it that are very specific for lithium because it takes a very small ion to fit into the site and be energetically favorable. So these are the two sorbents of choice. There also is a solvent extraction process developed in Israel, the Bateman process, and recently it has been improved and optimized, and it's currently, I think, being used or about to be used in Nevada and the lithium operations there. So we have three fairly mature technologies. All have been tested or pilot tested, and they all work satisfactorily in the salt and sea brines. People have solved the pretreatment process. Energy Source is probably the furthest along with this. They announced a successful pilot study 6 months or a year ago, before the virus. Cal Energy, as far as I know, hasn't started any developmental work. I don't know. And then CTR fully intends to do this, and they get their operations going. So all these methods can be improved, optimized, at least, to a small extent. You can improve the capacity, the kinetics, ease of use, durability, those sorts of things. One of the faults of the manganese technology is that when you do the acid regeneration, you lose some manganese. It has to either be recovered and reformulated into the sorbent or disposed of. One of the companies active in this is Lilac Solutions. They have patented the sort of a lot of variations on the LMO sorbent and are partnered with CTR. So that will probably be tested in the near future in operations in the field with controlled thermal reactors. All of this could very well, in my opinion, be superseded. When I was at Livermore, I worked on selective membrane processes. The membranes needed to do continuous extraction of lithium from brines have a lot of similarities with separators and lithium-ion batteries. In fact, we've tested a few of those in electrodialysis configuration. No tremendous results yet, but those battery separators are not optimized to do the separations we need for brines, and it's probably just a matter of reorienting some of the R&D work to develop those ion separators for use in harvesting lithium from brine. So we know it's possible to do all this too, because there are things known as potassium ion channels in cell walls that are very efficient at separating potassium from other monovalent ions. They use a gated, basically, think of it as a gated carbon nanotube that mimics the hydration sphere of the potassium ion very accurately and uses that as a source of selectivity. So although we have processes that work, they're pretty efficient and can work with the salt and sea, 10, 20 years down the road, we'll probably have a lot better technologies as a result both of lithium-ion battery development as well as developments for recycling. So what are the costs? So here we have a plot of cost of LCE, lithium carbonate equivalent, in thousands of dollars per ton. The current market price for lithium, the spot market is down around 7,000, 8,000. Long-term contracts are much higher. In terms of the various ways that lithium are produced that the other speakers have talked about. The salars of South America that are located in places where the climate is good, lots of wind, lots of dryness, and rich brines are incredibly low. As low as $1,200 a ton. So the idea of going into lithium production from any source and coming in underneath the salars of South America in these premium spots is not going to be achieved, I would say. More typical salars like those in Clayton Valley and other areas run the gamut for maybe a little less than $3,000 to $6,000 per ton. Estimates so far for geothermal are right in the middle of that range of the salar, something like $3,000 to $4,500 per ton, based on the existing manganese or aluminate or solvent extraction technology. The hard rock mining hectorite clays and spodumene are a little bit more expensive. The one thing going into using lithium from geothermal sources is that it will have different set of impurities than the hard rock and the salar sources. In doing work over the last 10 years of service work of testing clients' brines, they usually come with specifications for the final product, basically battery purity, pure enough to go into making batteries. And I've noticed that everybody gives me a separate, different set of specs. So I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's just that there's so much going on in lithium-ion battery development, but at some point we need to agree on what are the actual specifications, what elements are harmful in lithium batteries. I have the feeling that certain sources work, and that becomes the specs, whether or not the boron has to be less than 5 ppm or not. So that's an area that some further work would be useful. So what are the risks of all this? I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to see this happen, lithium pulled out of geothermal fluids. The things you hear when I was with Symbol, permitting and prolonged and expensive permitting efforts, and it's something new, and it's not clear exactly how it's going to shake out, but it is stalling things. And Rod could tell you a lot more about this with CTR and their efforts. There are some waste handling issues. You do have to pull some stuff out of the brine prior to lithium extraction, but that becomes a resource. There are metals in the sludge that you pull out of that so it's basically it's an ore body in itself, but we have to know how to deal with this. If we have to put it in a lined landfill for a while and go get it and pull it out to get the manganese and zinc out, I think that's under development and still needs to be finalized how we're going to go about that. Geothermal is always dissed for being in geologically active areas, but it has to be, and has very seldom been a real problem for keeping plants operating. The one thing I didn't mention before, the metals extraction from geothermal fluids has a long history. I actually sat at a well in 1980 trying to add sulfide to the fluid to precipitate zinc. In the late 1990s, there was an effort to extract zinc at the Cal Energy site. There was a successful pilot extraction at the Elmore site, and then they jumped to full-scale production. I think the cost was $300 million, and it failed. There was a lot of silica and iron precipitation on the ion exchange resins that were used in it, and it gave a real black mark to the whole idea of pulling metals out of these geothermal fluids. It's very much in the Cal Energy corporate history. Earlier, before COVID, I was working in New Zealand on extraction from very low salinity geothermal fluids. They have low salinity and they have low lithium content, but they're much easier to extract from. And we did a pilot study there and pulled lithium out of a 12 ppm fluid, and our extraction costs were in the range that I showed you for geothermal extraction. So the takeaway there was that the extraction is easy there. We could, if need be, to give investors more confidence that this can happen, it might behoove us to site with less lithium in the Salton Sea and go in there and show it's going to be successful. If there is that reticence on the part of people to invest in the capital needed to do this in the Salton Sea. So just to summarize, I'm pretty optimistic. I think geothermal lithium, probably energy source, is going to lead the way. In 2 to 3 years, they'll have a substantial showing of production at their plant, the John Featherstone plant. The cost of production of geothermal is likely to be less than hard rock mining. So if there's a shakeout in the industry, it won't be the geothermal producers that are shaken out. It will be the hard rock miners. And I don't see any major risk or impediments to if the right people, I think, are attacking the problem now. The group at Energy Source in particular have people that have experienced the ups and downs of the zinc plant, have worked with Symbol in their efforts. And I think I'm pretty optimistic something's going to happen here, and that battery manufacturers ought to consider, offtake agreements, including geothermal lithium, in the near future as that is likely to come about. That's it for me.
Wonderful. Thanks, guys. This was great, and I think we've got about 20 minutes now to chat about what we've just collectively discussed and presented. These were really great presentations. We heard a lot about opportunities for unconventional sources, the economics around doing this, the technology developments that are underway. So I think, across the spectrum from sort of lower technology readiness level to higher technology readiness level. Let me seed, a couple questions out to you guys. And I know that some of these questions have actually been addressed already, but when we think about the idea of scaling these technologies up, whether it's some of these ideas like that, Ravi, you brought up that are sort of at that kind of the lab scale or things that might be at, early development scale, what are some of the most pressing challenges, and thinking about the, whether it's the technology part, whether it's the economics, whether it's the policy, I mean, even things like, the idea of standards, when we think about the hardest challenges, and maybe this is a little bit from, when I think about this from the Department of Energy's perspective, where can, for example, government funding and partnerships, public-private partnerships, make a lot of impact to overcome those challenges. So, maybe I'll just put this out to walk through the group to facilitate this. David, if you've got some kind of quick comments, and Bill, Rod, and Ravi, if you want to kind of address what you think are the most pressing challenges to scale up. And then if you want to comment also on the challenges related to the domestic supply chain, you could bring those up maybe at the same time or in connection with that if you see strong connections. So David, maybe you want to hit that first.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I've been following the story in the Salton Sea for quite a while, since my days at Tesla and ever since then. And the challenge for scale up actually, I think, really comes down to it's almost it's really more of a challenge of confidence levels for investors, because the technologies available for extracting lithium today are good enough to commercialize. Like there's a couple of options, but in particular, the kind of work that Energy Source Minerals has pursued, they've struck the right balance basically behind finding the right sort of platform for the Salton Sea, and the next step is commercialization, and it's the proof of concept in that first commercial facility that needs to be demonstrated before you can start scaling up thereafter. And so from that point of view, I think the barrier to entry really comes down to investment, like moving around massive amounts of capital to not only address the risk of what will be, the first project into the Salton Sea and even potentially beyond, but it's the perceived risks around execution, and those perceived risks are with merit, in the sense that if you look at new projects that have been invested in over, say, the last couple of decades, at least in the Western world, the vast majority of them have, quite frankly, failed in one form or another. I think there were, between 2005 and 2015, there was about $1 billion of capital that went into new lithium production. And of the 5 projects that received, any of that money, only one of them came into production, and it came into production late, or later than scheduled, and over budget, and the rest didn't even come to market. So with that kind of track record, moving capital into the space does have its hurdles and challenges. So I would say that that's the number one risk and challenge for scaling up. Now, with regards to the supply chain, I think Tesla kind of leads by example in that sense, that there's this whole push towards working from first principles and working towards vertical integration, or at least co-locating and building an ecosystem of players across the value chain. And I think one thing that could really help the development of a lithium valley, so to speak, in Southern California, is if you can invite and co-locate. I mentioned this in my talk, that other parts of the value chain into the area, so that there's synergies that can be built upon, and that those synergies are material in terms of material flow, energy flow, et cetera, but also talent. Like if you've got a pool of talent throughout every step of the value chain to draw from, that's something that's hugely valuable. So what it really comes down to is, it'd be great if you can co-locate a cathode manufacturer, for example, in Southern California.
Great, thanks, David. Bill, do you want to add to that? Anything there?
Yeah, just say, there's a pretty spectacular example of things going to full scale and failing in the zinc plant from Cal Energies in the year 2000. They had a very successful pilot. I mentioned a little bit about this at Elmore, and I think 80 gallons a minute. Everything worked to make a final product of a high purity zinc product. And then they decided, instead of making a small commercial plant, to actually combine all the geothermal discharge from all their plants into one zinc facility. And it failed because the ion exchange resin, which was the first step, which was supposed to pull out the zinc, fouled with iron and silicon. That didn't happen in the pilot plant. And to tell you the truth, no one has ever really figured out why. So there's some issues like that inexplicable, that it behooves us probably to take baby steps and go slowly. That's why I added that one about maybe we do this at one of these low TDS, low lithium plants like Biawawi in Nevada, or another geothermal plant in the US that has lower amounts of lithium, but we're pretty sure we can get it out in economic amounts and show that we can do it before we step into the salt and seafood. That could go on concurrently too. But there are a lot of inexplicable things. With Symbol, a lot of work was done developing the process in their labs in Pleasanton, and they decided, this was after I was gone, that because it was so hard to control the manganese in their solutions in the oxidation state, they left it out. When they went to the site where there was 1,500 ppm manganese, it fouled the aluminum. So all these things need to go slowly and carefully and dot the I's and cross the T's, I think, as just the technical hindrances to start up. As far as the supply chain, I just feel like I've worked on rare earth extractions as well, and seen that the money to be made is up the value chain. And having the people that make the raw material also get involved in manufacturing the final products to some degree just adds a lot to the benefit of the lithium producer. And I see that as entering more and more sort of a more inclusive. That's basically what happened with the Chinese. The Chinese, the rare earths are a co-product of iron mining, And for years, they just sold them at $10 per kilogram until they realized if you separate them, they're worth $30 a kilogram. And then if you turn them into a final product, much more than that. So that enters into the economics of all this, I think, as people are well aware. But with the Salton Sea and the amount of lithium we have there, it behooves to explore that whole area of economic favorability up the supply chain.
Yeah, and I think, you know, interesting point about the issues of having low technology readiness challenges, or you know, new and emerging low technology readiness challenges that can occur or manifest themselves at different manufacturing scales. And I think for folks that have done technology transfer and scale up, you know, can recognize that the things can, you know, if what's the axiom, if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. And I think those things are those can be tough. So Rod, do you have any additions to what you've heard from David and Bill so far?
Well, I think, you know, David and Bill have certainly covered the technology. I'm not the technology guy, but I guess, you know, our approach to risk has been, you know, firstly, follow a strict instrument, whatever it is, JORC, or in the United States here, NI 43101, and that's what we have done. That's on technology and resource assessment. And it forces, in our case, we use Hatch to run that process, but it really forces us to go for a very careful selection process of various technologies. Again, we're not a technology company, we're a resource company, and deal with things like scale up. I mean, from non-technically speaking, scale up has been a big issue. It always will be, in the sense of vertical, you know, volume in cubic meters, if that makes sense. So our approach to scale up, and we've selected Lilac in that design, it is one module of say 10 or one module of 20 in one commercial module at our pilot phase, which we're working on at the moment. So that's been ours, but look, there's always risks there. The other one I think is probably more simple or holistic. We're very familiar. Jim Turner here is our general COO and was involved in developing the zinc plant. And you know, there's a lot of lessons learned out here, and some great work done by Symbol, Bill, and others. But you know, one of the simple ones was, if you got bad apples in the barrel, get rid of them. You know, the worst apple in the barrel out here is silica. You know, it's a problematic, one of the most problematic minerals that are there. So in our case, we completely remove it. You know, we've got 3 clarifiers in our design. So again, mining first and thermal heat second, drop the temperature for a single flash, then another 2 flashes for, you know, use of steam for processing. So there's nothing new and novel about what we're doing. It's just we may have reshuffled the deck a little, because we're not really dealing with spent brine. We looked at this as greenfield, and that's our approach. And I know that Bill, you know, spoke about sort of, we have to drop, you know, zinc and manganese and lead, but in our case, we've you know, I wouldn't say done a deal, but it is commercial slurry, and that'll go to a foundry, and you know, we'll sell that. We'll figure out the silica part of it. We don't like the concept of this anything going to landfills, to be quite honest. There is a market for silica even, but we just don't produce enough of it. So maybe it's a stockpile situation, wash it and move it to, because it's a fine micron material. Challenges, you know, firstly, I think there's some great work that New Energy Nexus have done here in the background with, you know, the Blue Ribbon Commission, Lithium Valley. Yeah, some of the drivers on that, we've, you know, contributed to that. I think some of the big drivers to sort of, I guess, get business here is look at the Gulf Coast. You know, look at what Georgia and you know, it really comes down to land tax. 100% of nothing is nothing. You know, there's nothing here at the moment. To get precursor guys, cathode guys, that would be very, very helpful. And I hope there's some sort of consideration going on there with that. Yeah, the enterprise zone, fast tracking of permitting. Personally, where we're located, you could not make it any worse. It's exposed lakebed playa. So, you know, putting concrete down would probably do it a favor. So, you know, I think there's some sensible, holistic approaches to that.
Great, Rod. Thanks. And Ravi, let's come back to you. I think we heard technical stuff. We also heard a little bit there, I think, almost policy related approaches. And so, Ravi, I mean, maybe thinking about both the technical challenges, for manufacturing, the technical challenges and opportunities for supply chain, and maybe if you also have a few thoughts about sort of policy drivers that could come into play, if that is appropriate or makes sense. Think about that, and we can. I know we're running with only a few minutes left, but go ahead, Ravi. Maybe hit that a little bit, and we can get a few more comments on from David, Bill, and Rod on some other policy ideas after that.
So I mean, first of all, I want to go back to scale up question, which is, I think, is a very important question. We have to go back in history. So our scientists got the Nobel Prize for battery, but battery is not manufactured in the United States. A lot of the components come from outside of the United States. So that's a very telling story. Solar is the same way. All the photovoltaic research, early stage research, was done here in the United States. But how many solar panels are made in the United States? So this is a much longer conversation, right? And there are reasons for that. So scale up has different levels. There is a scale up risk at different levels. One is when already David talked about it, at large scale investment. I think even at the R&D level, right? When you see a really nice piece of research being done at lab scale, and then what happens if people move on? Either the funding agency don't have an interest, or so there has to be some continuation to understand hardcore technical risk in taking something which has been demonstrated as centimeter by centimeter to at least a meter by meter, right? Things change. So that continuum has to be maintained, and that is still very high technical risk, just scaling it up. You have shown that this works, but just showing it at large scale. I think that will accelerate a lot of development and also de-risk some of the investment risks downstream, right? So I think any new technology that we talk about, whether it is lithium extraction technologies or we talk about any new manufacturing process, I think the question that you have asked, Joe, is a very important one for the country, right? How do we de-risk scale-up related issues, right? That's one. Second question that you had is about domestic supply chain. So I'll give the analogy with natural gas. America became energy independent because of unconventional extraction of unconventional natural gas, right? Because we developed a technology which is very hard for other people to copy, right? So I firmly believe that lithium, in the future of a renewable energy future where storage is going to play a very, very big role, whether it's lithium or cobalt, that's your currency. That's what energy independence will be about. So it is very, very important that as a country, we do have both technologies and policies in place for extracting these valuable resources. And I would say that, again, unconventional resources, it has to go back to some hardcore science and technology, because that's how we shine and we dominate. And policy can really help in that accelerating the transition and accelerating the deployment of new technologies. So for both, policy lever is very, very important, particularly when you talk about deployment and scale up. And what those policies are, that's a matter of debate. I mean, I think there are different viewpoints. But again, I mean, I think lithium is the future, at least for transportation, for sure.
Okay, thanks, Ravi. I know we've only got just a couple of minutes left, and David and Bill and Rod, maybe just quickly, summarizing, if you have any thoughts you haven't touched on, maybe the idea of policy. I know it's a very big, odd, difficult question. I think that is there's a lot there, and we definitely heard a lot about investment. But David, go ahead.
Yeah. So what I would say is that the emphasis for the right kind of policy will be one that attracts investment. At the end of the day, that's really what it's all about. And then you get the investment right, then you can have the flow of talent in the right direction, et cetera. But I would say, like, the focus of any policy development should be bring in investment and try to encourage a build out of an ecosystem. And I do know that, the CEC is working on building a lithium commission to focus on policy and what might translate into hopefully legislation or whatever, smart legislation. But yeah, that's really what I would say is the development of policy should focus on channeling investment and the build out of an ecosystem.
Great. Bill, Rod, if in the last minute or two we've got left, anything to add to that?
Go ahead, Rod. I don't have a coherent thought on that, so.
Yeah, I think just look at David's comments, obviously investment, but, fast tracking of permitting, the Salton Sea field, the known geothermal area has been studied to death. So I think, another study over studies. So I think that there's a lot of information that could be tied into maybe environmental permitting or some sort of fast track policy that assists the off-takers. I've seen some new policy mooted. I don't know whether it'll get through on a federal level that incentivizes US manufacturers to procure raw products or critical products from US suppliers. I think something around those lines would be very helpful. And the whole onshoring deal, as I mentioned earlier, sort of besides the fast tracking, but the tax, maybe some sort of land tax exemptions in a known defined enterprise zone would attract business, because I think the whole conversation was about the supply chain. Well, it could be all here, from raw materials, cathode battery, if the right sort of deals are put in place.
Yeah, there's a lot of actors through that whole supply chain that can come into synchronicity. So I think it's obviously in a very short period of time. It's a complicated question to answer. But thanks everybody for your participation. Rod, Bill, David, Ravi. I've learned a lot myself. This was really wonderful, and I know we're I think right at time. So I think with that the host will take over and we'll be done. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe Cresco. That was great.